on the screen. There's some folks that I know, which is great. So I really jump at an opportunity when I'm asked to be able to talk to the community about Howard Center, because one of the ways that I think of Howard Center is that we're really hidden. A lot of people don't really understand what we do. And a lot of our work is not necessarily defined by a building or a place that you go. A lot of it happens right in your communities. It's happening every day, and many of you might not be aware. So just a little bit to start off about Howard Center. We actually have a history of 150 years. Um, and we go back to the original roots of Howard Center was an orphanage that was formed during the Civil War. And if any of you are real history buffs, at that time there were a number of families and the way orphanages operated, and not the way we sometimes think about them today, where it's sort of for the entire young person's childhood, but it might be for a year or two. And families at that time experienced tremendous hardship. And there are actually two orphanages that were formed in Burlington. If you're a serious history buff, there was the orphanage for those who identified as Catholic, St. Joseph's, and the orphanage that was identified for those who are Protestant, which was the Home for the Destitute Children. And that's the early roots of Howard Center. So that was 150 years. A lot has happened since then. Today, we serve more than 19,000 clients and community members across, it's actually not just Chittenden County, but we actually have work outside of Chittenden County too. And we actually, as an employer, we have 1,600 people on our payroll. So we're one of the larger employers in the state. And we have locations, actually 60 locations throughout Vermont. Again, our sort of who we touch, both in terms of who we serve and who we employ is pretty broad. So like, what's our mission? We basically help people and communities, and I'm underscoring, especially for this group, that in addition to people, there's a mission part about communities. We help people and communities thrive by providing supports and services to address mental health, substance use, and developmental needs. So there's sort of our like core areas, and then there's so much more. So like underneath all that, who are we? We're really a multi-service agency. Some people think of us as a mental health provider, some think of us as a substance use provider, some know us as an educational provider, and some know us as we provide services to folks who have developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities. But we're really serving across the lifespan. So again, this is, some people don't realize this, we have programs for families with very young children, in-home programs. We do a lot in childcare centers, where we basically provide consultation to childcare centers to be able to support children who are struggling, to be able to be in those childcare centers and to needs that families might identify. All the way to we have programs for seniors. So we actually have a program called Elder Care, where we have mental health clinicians who go into the homes of seniors who are homebound and need mental health services. And then we have everything in between. So there's quite a bit of breadth of what we're doing. And right here in Williston and Richmond, given this group that you're going to hear a little bit later from Lisa, who's our director of the Jean Garvin School, which is the school that's been based right here in Williston, very close to where you all are right now. And she's going to talk about that. Right in the Williston-Richmond area, we have school-based clinicians in every school in your community. So they don't go to work in the morning at Howard Center. They actually report into your public schools and work with the team there. All the referrals come from the school, and then they get their supervision and their oversight and are employed by Howard Center. And then we also have staff, what we call interventionists, who support students who need more intensive support. So that happens right in your school. We also have a site sort of on 2A called, we call it Night Lane. And it is an area for where our folks who have developmental disabilities can come, get support, have classes, and basically be integrated into the community. And very close to here. And then Hurricane Lane and everything had to do. And when they left, Howard Center has been leasing some space there, where we actually have our IT team is based there. And we also have a program called ARCH. We're really good at Howard Center with a lot of acronyms. So if I slip, I'm going to try to not do it too much, but feel free to raise your hand, like, what in the world are you talking about? But the ARCH program is actually an acronym for Accessing Resources for Children, very clever. And it's actually a program designed for children who might have multiple needs, particularly needs that might be both developmental disabilities as well as mental health needs. And as Howard Center grew and grew, we had all these specialized programs. And one of the things that we heard from families is, it's so confusing. Where do I start? What do I do? And particularly with young children, like what's really the challenge? What's the most important thing I pay attention to? And we created this team where it's basically an open door. And if your young child needs that kind of support, so they have some care coordinators and they're based there, right in Hurricane Lane. So that's just to give you a flavor of like programs that are based in Williston. Then we also have, and Rick knows well about this. We also, and again, Williston and Richmond were very involved in this. We have a team called our Community Outreach Team, and communities around Burlington, including Williston and Richmond, came together. I would use the term banded together because it was pretty incredible, the level of collaboration that happened, and decided that they wanted to have a team similar to what Burlington had. Burlington has a team called the Street Outreach Team. And they basically do outreach to help people who are experiencing some kind of distress, but they're individuals who struggle to pick up the phone and call, whether it be Howard Center or another service, or maybe perhaps don't quite trust the system, whether it be the mental health system, whether it be the healthcare system, whatever that might be. And so the whole point is to do that kind of outreach. So the towns came together, all contributed some resources. The state was so impressed by the level of cooperation. The state provided some resources. The hospital, UVMMC, provided some resources, and it all in turn funded what we call the Community Outreach Team. And it's a team of 6 outreach workers that actually support all the towns, partner very closely with law enforcement. And one of their goals is to, when law enforcement gets a call about somebody in distress, but it's not really a law enforcement issue, it's really somebody that needs some support, figuring out what they need. Our outreach team members go sometimes solo, depending on what the call looks like, sometimes go in tandem with law enforcement. And then over time, as they get to know people, they may be getting the calls directly. But that team is pretty, I would say, just about 4 years now that we've had that. It keeps really close data. There's a steering committee that meets regularly and kind of looks at both the numbers to understand sort of is the team at capacity. We have added to the team. They've added their hours. So that's a pretty exciting initiative. I saw a question. Oh, great question. The outreach team are not master's level clinicians, and that's strategic. We have a crisis team that has folks that have advanced degrees, masters in social work or in counseling, who have a more formalized role about a formal assessment that needs to happen if somebody needs a hospital level of placement, that sort of thing. This is strategic. The outreach workers are folks who are generally bachelor's level, who have experience in reaching out to folks who are in distress. And then they team with our crisis team, which is called First Call for Chittenden County. So that's their credentials. And so that's been strategic. And we've used that same model around credentialing for our street outreach team in Burlington and have found it really effective that way. Yeah, so it's a great question. Was there another question?
Just a quick one. You said their hours have changed. We we're interested in the community outreach group at the food shelf because we have a number of marginalized customers that come in. And it used to be that your outreach workers only work till like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Have they extended?
Yeah, they have. They're up to 7 or 8 at night now. Yeah. So they have, and again, measuring that in terms of both in terms of how how the team can cover that, but also the calls. But what they were feeling is that the 5 o'clock, there was just things that they need to be available for. And really, as that team started, we knew all along the goal was to expand the hours. Yeah. The success story about that, and this is good for this group to know, that community outreach team, when it came about, initially we had funding from the hospital that was year to year. So we had to apply for a grant, had to prove that it was making a difference. The outcomes for that team were so successful that the support the hospital provides now is built into their operational budget, which for any of you like really looking at budgets, and that was a major coup. In terms of, they said there's no question that what this team is doing is I mean, I think you can think of, they were saving the hospital money, because what they're able to do is that they're able to reach and support people. So the folks that are going to the emergency department are the ones that really need to go to the emergency department. Again, kudos to the team, and really deep appreciation. This would never have happened. The leadership, the other story about this is that the creation of that team really happened from leadership from the surrounding towns. That's where it started, and that momentum then really then leveraged support from the state and from the hospital. So that's an exciting success story. Some other pieces of work that we do at Howard Center that is much harder to show, and this is part of why I jump at the chance to tell the story about Howard Center, is the work that happens in people's homes and at work sites. So I mentioned a crisis team. We have a team called First Call for Chittenden County. It's been around, and actually Lisa was part of the early days of the children's team, and the children's team, first name was First Call for Children and Families. And that team was so successful and reaching out to the community, spending time in people's homes and living rooms and kitchens to work through problems, that really inspired us to take the rest of the crisis teams at Howard Center, because at one point Howard Center had 3 different crisis teams, and brought them all together. So what we call now First Call is First Call for Chittenden County. And it's really, you call that number. It's right in this handy your packet. I'll just show and tell. And here, there's a booklet in there that has a guide to all of our programs. And in the front is sort of like, how do you even start? And there's a number for both our main number, where you can just call if you're looking for services, and then our crisis number. So they're meant to be really easy for people to get to. But our crisis team is one that you're rarely going to see our crisis team in action, because their goal is to be with people in the community, generally if they can in their homes. Sometimes it would be at our agency, and sometimes in the emergency department. We also have folks that are doing work, what I would call supported employment. So we have a pretty extensive supported employment program for adults, whether the adult has mental health challenges or the adult is struggling with developmental disabilities. And you would find those folks like they're getting supported in your places that you go out in the community. And you might notice that they need a little bit of support. They may or may not be a Howard Center client, but I will say that that kind of work is happening all across Chittenden County. And then you'll also find that we have staff who are basically supporting people one-on-one in the community, so they can live in the community and be supported. And that's also really, they could be in a coffee shop, they could be walking in the mall, they could be in a park. That would be Howard Center staff supporting somebody to be in their community. And I also should mention that we do a lot of family work or in-home work to support people that may have a residence, but to be able to stay in the community. So that could look like a case manager going to somebody's home for an adult. It could look like one of our family clinicians that's supporting a family and meeting with them regularly to really help that family work through whatever the challenges that young person could have. So it's really a breadth of kind of services that we provide. In this book, one of the things that I've learned, that you start to talk too many about all the programs at Howard Center, people start to get blurred, because it's like too much. But what we tried to do, that I particularly feel good about this, is that instead of naming, you can go alphabetically. If you know somebody that works at Howard Center and they work in a certain program, you can look it up alphabetically. But if you just want to get a sense of what we do, the programs are grouped. Community support, I talked a lot about that right now. We do work with criminal justice, so supporting people either coming out of being incarcerated, or dealing with people after they've been in court and they have certain conditions. We work very closely with the criminal justice system. Crisis, I mentioned. Lisa's going to talk and give an example of our educational services that we have. Employment that I mentioned. We also have what often people think it's the only thing Howard Center does. We do outpatient services. As you might think, sort of traditionally, people like somebody goes to see a counselor. Well, we definitely have therapists, counselors for, again, the age range, and people can come to us for that. And they also now can use telehealth for that, depending what works best for them. The part that I haven't mentioned that we have, and it's grouped, is residential services. So while we're a community agency, we also have residential programs, and that's really for, we have some for children, and then we have our largest grouping is what we call under long-term supports and services. And it's primarily for adults that for them to be able to live in the community, they need more support in a residence. All of our residential homes are small. So really part of Howard Center's roots is really stepping away from institutions. So we try to keep the residential programs small, and they are spread out across Chittenden County in terms of our residential programs. And it would really be supporting, again, it could be somebody with coping with significant mental illness that needs a lot of support in order to be able to live in the community. It could be somebody that had a developmental disability and they need more support than what they could receive from their family, or what we call shared living providers, which is another piece we have. It's a term that many people have not heard before, but it's I think shared living provider. What is that? And it's a way that we support people with developmental disabilities to, they basically live with a family. So some people term it adult foster care, and then others get offended by that term because it has nothing, you're not like a ward of the state if you do that. But basically somebody opens up their home, they're paid a stipend, and they support a person with a developmental disability, and they become part of their family. And that is the way that, again, we have over 200 homes in Chittenden County where people with a developmental disability are supported that way and allows them to live in the community. And what we believe so strongly in that model is that for many of the people we support, they really are part of the community as opposed to being separated in some way. So again, that's work that Howard Center does that you would not, like if somebody was in your community, I can pretty much guarantee you in Williston and Richmond, you've come across families with that are shared living providers. And unless they are sharing that with you or they're a close neighbor, you might not know, but you just might notice that there's somebody with a developmental disability living with them. And that could very well be part of one of the programs that we do. And then lastly, in terms of the grouping in the book, is that we also are known pretty well for, we have a pretty deep expertise as it relates to substance use services. So one thing I should say about Howard Center's history and how this came about is in 1994, happened to be the year I joined the organization. I had no idea how big a deal this was until afterwards. But in 1994, 3 agencies came together to form what is now Howard Center. So there was what was known as Howard Mental Health. And then there was an agency called Champlain Drug and Alcohol. As the name implies, they were a small agency, but had deep expertise in substance use treatment. And then the third agency was known as the Baird Center for Children and Families. That's where Lisa started. So the Baird Center was a child serving agency. It was actually the agency that was most closely linked to the Home for the Destitute Children, but it continued on in its history to do a lot of child serving work, but had more of what we call a child welfare focus. It had some residential programs, did a lot of work with the Department of Children and Families for children that were in DCF custody. Those 3 agencies came together. And by coming together, we created a very deep bench as it relates to mental health and a very deep one as it relates to substance use treatment and then with children. So today, as it relates to substance use treatment, and again, this book goes much deeper into it, we were the first organization in the state to start the first methadone clinic. So that's basically today what we call that is medicated assisted treatment, and it's known as a hub. It's where folks who are struggling with an opioid use disorder can receive treatment and wraparound services. When that was created, there was a lot of opposition. We were one of the few states in the country that didn't have any methadone treatment in a clinic. The governor at the time was opposed to it. It was Governor Dean, actually, interestingly, because his experience was of clinics, methadone clinics in large cities, felt like there was concerns there. There was a lot of advocacy, and in the end, we were able to open this up, and today we serve over 1,000 individuals there and support them in terms of being able to be active in the community and to be in recovery. And in addition to that, we provide what's called office-based medication-assisted treatment, which means that people can go to their physician or their physician in an office space and be prescribed medication to help them with an opiate use disorder. Might not need as much of an intensive wrap that we get in our Chittenden clinic, but can receive the medication and support. And we do that both in Chittenden County. I also just want to mention, I know this is a Williston-Richmond group, but we have quite a base of our substance use treatment up in Franklin County. So we've had that history there. We've continued that. So we provide intensive treatment up there. And there's more I could say around the substance use treatment, but it gives you a sense of just our background there. And then I think just I will mention in your packet, there's a booklet on suicide prevention. And that really grew out of, we have a long history of providing crisis services. And what we know is the importance of being able to educate the public and families about how do you prevent, reduce the risk of suicide. We put together this booklet as one is like a public service to really get the word out about some good basic information around suicide prevention, and really the importance of people knowing the importance of support, of reaching out if they're worried about somebody. And we also, as an agency, and some of you may have been a part of this, that in addition to suicide prevention, we do something called postvention, which people think, what in the world is postvention? But what we know in the field is that after something traumatic has happened, whether somebody's died by suicide or sometimes some other unexpected death that was very tragic, that those who are particularly impacted are at greater risk for themselves, and the importance of being able to provide them support. So as an agency, we work to have teams to, whether it be, again, a family that's impacted and is open to getting support, and the moment, whether there's times we've gone to schools where there's been a tragedy and supporting that school. And often schools may have support systems, but they would like some additional support. We do that kind of work. And we've gone to businesses where there's been a sudden death, a tragedy, and people are trying to figure out like how to move forward with that. So that's another important piece that we're involved in. So how do we do this? Like, how does it get funded? Which is probably, it's a whole other talk, but I felt like it was critical for this group to be aware of. Mainly, our funding for the most part comes from the state, and the state funding comes from the federal government, if you want to follow that chain. So a lot of it is Medicaid, which is a federal source, but then the state has to pay a certain match to have that Medicaid. Most of our programs are through a contract with the state of Vermont. So we are not state employees, but we are heavily dependent on the state. So when you follow things in the legislature about what's being approved, it will be the state government will make a decision about what level they're going to fund programs like we're called a designated agency. And then the legislature will determine whether they support that budget, whether they do an increase or even less than what the administration offered. This past legislative session, we were very fortunate. For those of you who track that closely, the legislature actually increased the allocation to the designated agencies to an 8% on a rate. So we get paid. We do not get paid for most of our programs on capacity. We get paid if we do the work. We get a certain rate for it, and they increase that rate. And it doesn't cover all our programs, but we were very fortunate. So I would say that this year, particularly with the focus on, it helped that the state had many federal dollars that came in that helped with that, and also the incredible attention to the level of mental health need in our state helped with that allocation. So that's just for you to have a sense. And then our other funding is we do bill insurances, and then philanthropy. You know, we do a lot of support for programs that aren't adequately funded. And then just one other piece that people ask about, what does it mean to be a designated agency? Because it's kind of a strange term, and it means that there are some of our work we're designated charged with doing. And so there are, I've talked about Vermont's history about moving people out of institutions. Our charge is that for people who maybe 2 to 3 decades ago would have been in either the Waterbury State Hospital for mental health reasons, might have been in the Brandon Training School that was for folks with developmental disabilities, or might have been in the Weeks School. All of those institutions were disbanded, and that the charge was, our state said they should be served in the community. Howard Center is responsible and mandated as being a designated agency to serve individuals who would have been in an institution with a developmental disability or for significant mental illness, not all mental illness, but significant, that would have warranted them having to be hospitalized, and also for children who would have had to have been in an institution. So that's what the designated part is. There's a lot that Howard Howard Center does that's more what I would call upstream, serving people before they might have to be at that level of care. But it's important for folks to know that that's part of our charge that that we're responsible for doing. So I want to pause for a moment. I'm thinking I can certainly take questions as they come, but want to be sure that I allow time for Lisa to talk a little bit about the Jean Garvin School. And I think and part of a transition, I thought to step away a little bit about talking about Howard Center and just also have a bit in this conversation about sort of what we're seeing right now in our state and in our country as it relates to mental health and substance use, just in terms of the level of need. I would just say that like mental illness, what we know is one of the most common health conditions in the country. 1 in 5 Americans right now will have some form of a mental illness in a given year. And more than 50% of Americans will experience some type of mental illness in their lifetime. And then for those folks who have a more significant mental illness, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, 1 in 25 Americans will experience that at some point in their lifetime. So the point in sharing those statistics is just to say that it's really, either for yourself, a family member, a loved one, a neighbor, that mental health issues are very, very common. And the reality right now is what's happened with the pandemic, that we're finding an increase in terms of people struggling with their mental health and needing services. So how does it tie with the substance use concerns? There's a lot of people are very familiar with the term self-medicated. When people are struggling, they're anxious or they're depressed. One of the reasons using, whether sometimes it can be alcohol, overuse of alcohol, sometimes it can be other substances, is that substances do short-term take the edge off some anxiety and can help with some of those symptoms. Long-term, they can cause more problems. The other part is what we know, there's a lot more brain science. And some of my colleagues at Howard Center could do a whole 101 around the brain science and substance use. But suffice to say, the way I look at it is that within our brain, there's a reason why substances can give that relief. And that is also ties into why it can be really difficult for people when they start using substances and misusing them to address their misuse. Substance use is misuse is really common. And just a little stat for that is that there's over 20 million Americans that are over 12 and over that are impacted by some form of it, and a formal, what they call substance use disorder. So the instance is very high. And the importance of saying that is just, again, one of the pieces that for Howard Center and for myself as a professional is really busting the stigma, because we still live in a society where it's much easier to say, my loved one, my neighbor is just got a cancer diagnosis. It is so much harder for somebody to say, my neighbor, my loved one just needed to go into treatment for substance use yesterday. That we still have a lot of stigma around that. We have stigma that we're breaking it. We have people every day on the media. We can think of some pretty famous athletes who've been able to say, I'm struggling with my mental health issues. Simone Biles is coming to mind right now for me, who's, just can be open about it. And I'm like, oh, what she's doing. But I also just want to say that every single day at Howard Center, we see people who we wish they had come to see us earlier. And it's stigma that's getting in the way of, and shame of feeling of asking for help. So I needed to do that little, it's my public health message, along with talking about Howard Center, about the real importance of being able to talk about these issues and feel like it's that it's okay, and it's so common in our world. So with that, I'd like to segue to have Lisa talk a little bit. Lisa Billowith, as Elliot said, has been over 3 decades with Howard Center and has been in a number of different roles with the agency. But in her, I want to say now it's been, is it over 15 or close to 20 now at Jean Garvin? 1998. Okay. Yeah, so so Lisa's been leading the Jean Garvin School, which is very close to where we're sitting right now. And there's all kinds of exciting developments. And so she's going to come up and talk to you a little bit about that. And then we'll both be here for questions. That work for folks?
Thank you, everybody, for having Catherine and I today. So the Jean Garvin School, we've been in existence since 1997. We've been in Williston for 17 years, and 16 of those, I think, unless you were purposefully looking for us, you might not have known we were there. We were kind of tucked away on Harvest, off of Harvest Lane. And then a couple of years ago, we were busting at the seams there and wanting to expand Garvin. So we thought it would be a really good idea to build a new school during a pandemic. And we last August moved into 55 Day Lane, which is the building where Jazzercise was, if folks are familiar with Jazzercise. So we are in that whole building now. And it is not quite done being renovated, but we're very close to that. So that's where we are now. And we are, even though it's only about a half a mile from where we used to be, it's much more in the center of things, where we have residential neighbors, businesses all around us. And so it's been a really great move. So the Jean Garvin School is one of 4 Howard Center schools and is a therapeutic school, and is also one of many independent schools in Chittenden County. One way that we're different from not only other Howard schools, but other schools in Chittenden County is we're a consortium school. So that means that every school district in Chittenden County owns our school and contracts with Howard Center to run the school. And the special ed directors from each school district sit on a governing board, and they make up the consortium for the Jean Garvin School. So we serve students who are in 7th through 12th grade, so 12 to about 18 or 19 years old. We have, up until this year, been serving 27 students in what we call a small group milieu program. So our students, day to day, we look very much like a public middle school or high school in terms of the schedule that they follow, the classes that they're in, and then we embed a lot of therapeutic supports for them, both within their academic classes and then also separately in other therapeutic groups. Jean Garvin, who we are named after, was the first special ed director for the state of Vermont. And she was appointed, I think, back in the 70s. She was a huge advocate and proponent for students with special education needs, and really lobbied very strongly in the 70s to move those students out of basements, small rooms, and get them back into classes with their peers, get supports into public schools. And she worked really hard to do that. And just a little side note, when we moved into our new space, the day we were moving into our new space last August, a woman was walking her dog in the parking lot, and she actually introduced herself to us. She used to work with Jean Garvin, was very good friends with her, and had all kinds of stories and anecdotes. So I thought that was kind of fun to meet her. So let's see what else. So we have, like I said, been serving 27 students in grades 7 through 12. About maybe 5 years ago, one thing that everyone in Chittenden County seemed to notice is that waiting lists for schools like ours were getting really, really long. The acuity we were seeing in students, then their needs were getting more increased. And so the consortium began the discussion of, do we want to expand the Garvin School? And over time, we came to the decision that yes, we did want to expand the Garvin School. So in August, we are opening a second program, which is one of the reasons we moved to Day Lane, is that the school is much bigger. So we'll be opening a second program, which will be a more intensive program than the program we're serving now. And so the intensive program is going to be called the Delta program. Our current program we're going to call the Odyssey program. So the Delta program will eventually serve 27 students who need more therapeutic and academic support than our current program, and also who will benefit from more of an experiential learning. So those students, while they'll have academic instruction in classes, will spend their afternoons actually in the community doing experiential learning, whether that's internships or jobs or service learning. And they will be supported more, staff supported with more clinical staff, more academic staff, And we are also hiring an employment specialist who will work with both programs. And so that person will be reaching out to partners in the Williston community to talk about how we can partner together to support students to learn skills to then move on to jobs or higher education. So we're really, really excited about that. We started focusing probably 3 or 4 years ago on service learning for our students. And many of you may be familiar that most high schools now, as part of your graduation requirements, there is some level of service learning that has to happen. It's different high school to high school, but we started focusing on service learning. One of the projects that one of my students finished last year is that we've put a little food pantry on the corner of Day Lane and the driveway into our building. And so it's very exciting. It's registered with the littlefoodpantry.org, and also 211 now has that. And so we have been, since I think that went up in June, and we've been ourselves stocking it. I've noticed just this week that neighbors in the neighborhood are stocking it as well now. Someone left a bunch of fresh vegetables and fruits. It's stocked with food and non-perishable foods and personal hygiene products. So that's also, as you mentioned, the food shelf. That's also someplace that folks can come and help themselves to food. Yeah. One of the things that I think makes Garvin School successful for students is the small groups that students are able to, public schools are now maybe 25 students in a classroom. We have 6 to 8 students in each of our groups. So it's much smaller group instruction. It's very relationally based. So we're able to really work with students and families around what their needs are and individualize programming to some extent. The other part about Gene Garvin School is that every year, probably 7 to 11 of our students are spending part of their day with us and part of their day in their public school. We work really hard to really build that bridge back to public school for our students. And a majority of our students do end up transitioning back to their public school and or staying in that relationship where they're with us part day and with the public school part day. We also, many of our students continue to play sports for their sending school districts. So we have a lot of athletes that come to our schools. So I think that really helps students feel reclaimed by their school and helps families to really overcome some school trauma that they've had.
Okay, so are these kids that have just had a hiccup in their school, like they go through to 7th grade and something happens, or 8th grade or whatever, and they just get a little off track, and this is to get them back on track, and then they transition back to public school?
So our students, it's a wide gamut. So yes, some of our students have hiccups. Some of our students have had difficulties since kindergarten. And some of our students will stay with us through 12th grade, or they may leave us and go to a different alternative program. It really runs the gamut. We have students who have mental illness. We have students with who are on the autism spectrum. We have students who, for whatever reason, a small group is really what's going to be most supportive and successful for them. What I do know from public school districts is, with our current program that we've had, one of the indicators for referral to our current program from the public school perspective is that these are students who want to be in school. They might not be able to be successful in a public school, but they want to be in school, and that they may want to transition back. So because our school looks and feels a lot like typical school, those students can often make that leap.
So I think we have time just for one more question. This is amazing. And I think all of us know that there's a Howard Center out there, but to understand the breadth of what you all do is pretty astonishing, really. So we could spend a lot of time on this, but if there's one more question, maybe, as opposed to 1,000 questions, which I have. Well, thank you both so much for coming. This was wonderful. Yeah, what an
For
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Good. So now our sergeant well, actually, before we do the sergeant at arms,
Let's have one of our speakers pick our raffle ticket. Here you go. Those are the last three numbers on the ticket.
637.
Hey, that's me. I just said I never wanted.
Thank you very much. And now our sergeant at arms will take over.
Well, good morning. First of all, my socks today, which are not particularly colorful, but they do reveal a message about me, which says selective hearing specialist. And I found that that's
All right, Charles.
Charlie's always going to one up me. I'll get you next week. Right. I found that's a useful adaptation to life. So for myself, I will kick things off. A couple of happy things. My grandson, Sam, who some of you know, who's going into his junior year in college.